Hello.
And then Duke jumped right over the big fence, and he got stuck in all that sticky mud.
Naomi Carter had crossed 4 states with a trunk that used to belong to her mother, a letter folded so many times. The creases had gone soft, and exactly one plan: marry a stranger, build a life, and never again be the woman people in Ashtabula called still unmarried at 26, behind cupped hands at church socials. She had not expected the plan to include a goat. The coach driver dropped her at the crossroads outside Fredericksburg with her trunk and a warning. "You're headed for Bishop Land," he said, not unkindly. "Just careful the way a man is careful when he thinks he's doing you a favor. Folks call him the bear out there. Big man, quiet as a held breath. Don't go crossing him." A woman waiting for the same coach added her own version. He'd once lifted a grown man off his feet by the collar and set him down outside a barn dance like he was moving furniture. Nobody had seen the man again after that. A third traveler, an older gentleman with a fine watch chain, chimed in unbidden that he'd heard the fellow kept no company at all save 2 orphaned children he never brought to town if he could help it. Naomi thanked all 3 of them, and did not let her hands shake, though. By the time the coach rattled off toward San Antonio, she had collected enough warnings to fill a small pamphlet. She walked the last half-mile because the trunk wasn't so heavy that pride couldn't carry it, and because she wanted a moment alone with her own nerve before she needed it. The land here was gentler than she'd expected, rolling hills studded with live oak, a creek glinting somewhere off to her left. The kind of country that looked like it might, with enough patience, forgive a person for arriving with nothing but a letter and a trunk. The house came into view. First good stone, a wide porch, curtains someone had hung with care and never quite gotten straight. Then came the barn. Then came the sound. It was a man's voice, low and utterly serious, arguing with something that was very clearly not a person. "That hat belonged to my mother," he was saying. "You can chew on the fence post. You cannot chew on the hat." Naomi came around the corner of the barn and stopped. How was enormous. She'd give the gossips that much kneeling in a patch of mud, with his good church trousers already ruined, a battered black hat, held just out of reach of a gray goat, with a look of pure criminal intent in its eyes. On his head, slightly crooked, sat a crown cut from butcher paper and decorated with what appeared to be crayon jewels. A small boy stood nearby with his arms crossed, supervising with the gravity of a courtroom bailiff. "You're doing it wrong," the boy informed him. "Kings don't beg. Kings don't have goats named Duke either, Jonah, and yet here we are." Naomi set down her trunk. 3 days of careful letters, back and forth, of picturing a man built the way rumor built him, and this was what waited at the end of the road, a giant on his knees, bargaining with livestock, wearing a paper crown without a trace of shame. He looked up and saw her. For a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. The goat took the opportunity to seize the hat and bolt for the tree line triumphant. "Well," the man said, getting to his feet, with the unhurried calm of someone who had already accepted the hat was lost. He did not remove the crown. "You must be Mrs. Carter." "Not yet," Naomi said. "Currently just a woman watching a king lose a war to a goat." Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but its nearest relative. "Gideon Marsh," he said. "I'd shake your hand, but it's currently covered in mud and goat spit, and I'd rather make a better second impression than I did a first." "I don't know," Naomi said. "I thought the first one had a lot going for it." The boy, Jonah, had gone very still, watching her the way children watch strangers who might be staying. A small girl had appeared in the barn doorway, too dark-haired, solemn, gripping the frame with both hands and saying nothing at all. Her eyes moving between Naomi's face and the trunk at her feet, as though trying to calculate exactly how permanent this new arrival intended to be. Naomi understood in that instant that whatever she had traveled here to marry, she had also traveled here to be looked at, measured, and possibly found wanting by two children who had already lost more than they should have had to at their age. "You were warned about me," Gideon said. It wasn't a question. Several times, very dramatically, one gentleman implied you might eat the male if it displeased you. It's the goat who eats things that displease him. I've never developed the habit myself. He glanced toward the tree line, where Duke had vanished with his prize, and something like resignation crossed his face. "That's the third hat this year. And now," Naomi pressed, since he hadn't quite answered the first question, "now I'm wondering what a man has to do around here to earn a reputation like that." "It's a long story," Gideon said, and something in his voice closed like a door being pulled too gently but firmly, the crown still sitting crooked and slightly ridiculous on his head. "Come inside. May's got supper on, and Etta's been rehearsing what she's going to say to you for 2 days, though she won't admit it." The little girl in the doorway flushed red and disappeared into the barn's shadows so fast the hem of her dress caught on the frame. Naomi picked up her trunk before he could reach for it, mostly to prove she could, and followed the Bear of Bishop Ranch toward the house, already certain that whatever waited inside would have very little to do with anything the coach driver had told her. The house smelled like wood smoke and old paper and faintly like bread gone slightly wrong. Naomi found the source. Within the hour, a lopsided loaf cooling on the windowsill. The crust cracked in 3 places, like it had tried to escape the oven and given up halfway. "Etta made that," Gideon said, setting Naomi's trunk down in the small room off the hallway, with more gentleness than a trunk that size required. "Don't tell her it's not right. She's been reading Mother's recipe book and she gets prickly about it." "I wouldn't dream of it," Naomi said, and meant it. A crooked loaf made by a grieving 8-year-old deserved better than criticism. Supper was a quiet, careful negotiation of a different kind than the one with the goat. May the older woman who came twice a week to help with the heavier housework had left a pot of stew warming on the stove and gone home before Naomi's arrival, so it fell to the 4 of them alone to fill the long table with something like conversation. Etta sat rigid at the far end, offering Naomi exactly the information required, and nothing more. Yes, she'd made the bread. No, she didn't need help. Yes. That was her mother's recipe book on the shelf. The one nobody was allowed to move. Jonah, by contrast, narrated the entire meal without being asked, including a full account of the goat's crimes going back several months, complete with a dramatic reenactment involving his fork as Duke and a biscuit standing in for the stolen hat. Naomi listened more than she spoke. She had learned teaching school children back in Ohio that the quiet ones told you more than the loud ones if you simply gave them room. Etta's eyes kept drifting toward the recipe book on the shelf like a tether she couldn't quite let go of even mid-sentence, even while insisting she didn't care one way or another whether anyone touched it. "Your mother's handwriting?" Naomi asked, finally nodding toward it. Etta's chin lifted, braced for an argument that didn't come. "Nobody's touched it since she died. Uncle Gideon won't even open it." "I don't cook," Gideon said mildly, from the head of the table, though something in his jaw had tightened in a way that told Naomi the subject went considerably deeper than flour and butter. "You could learn," Naomi said. "I could." He agreed in the tone of a man agreeing to something he had no intention of doing, and the subject closed itself as neatly as a book, though. Naomi noticed he didn't quite meet anyone's eyes for the rest of the meal. That first night, after the children had gone to bed, and the house had settled into its unfamiliar creaks and sighs, Naomi lay awake in the small room and heard footsteps in the hall, slow and deliberate, pausing outside her door. She held very still, unsure whether to call out, until the footsteps moved on toward the kitchen, and she heard faintly the scrape of a chair, and then nothing at all for a long while. She found in the morning that the lock on her door, which had stuck badly the night before, refusing to turn no matter how she jiggled, it had been oiled and fixed sometime after midnight, and a small brass key sat on the corner of her dresser where it hadn't been before. No note, no explanation. Just the quiet fact of it, the way a man says something he can't say out loud by doing it instead. She held the key for a long moment before she understood what it meant. It meant he had noticed the lockstick, though she hadn't mentioned it. It meant he had gotten up in the dark, gone looking for his oil can, and knelt at her door while she slept, doing a small, unremarkable thing that nobody had asked of him. It meant whatever else he was, whatever the coach driver and the woman at the crossroads believed about him. Gideon Marsh paid attention to small, unspoken things and had decided, apparently without deliberation, that Naomi's comfort was worth a lost hour of his own sleep. She dressed and went down to the kitchen to find Jonah standing on a stool at the counter, attempting badly to make coffee flour dusted across his shirt from some earlier, entirely unrelated disaster involving, as far as she could tell, an argument with the biscuit tin. "Uncle Gideon usually does this," he said, without turning around, in the voice of a boy trying very hard to sound like it didn't matter that his uncle hadn't come down yet. "Well," Naomi said, rolling up her sleeves, "today he's got help." She reached for the recipe book on the shelf, carefully asking Etta's silent permission, with her eyes, before her hand landed on it, since the girl had appeared in the doorway just in time to witness the reach, and found, tucked inside the cover, in careful looping handwriting, a note that wasn't a recipe at all. "For whoever loves my babies when I can't." Naomi closed the book gently and set the coffee to boil and said nothing, because some things a person needs to sit with alone before they can be spoken of at all. By the time Gideon came downstairs, hair still damp from washing, the kitchen smelled of coffee and faintly of bread rising. Naomi's this time, made from a recipe copied out in a dead woman's hand and passed wordlessly into a stranger's. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the room like it was slightly unfamiliar to him, though nothing in it had moved except the light and the particular hush of someone else having claimed the stove. "You found the book," he said. "Etta let me borrow it." He looked at his niece, who was very carefully not looking up from her plate, cheeks pink with something that might have been pride. "Did she?" he said quietly, and Naomi understood that this, a crooked loaf, a fixed lock, a book finally opened after 2 years shut, was as close to a beginning as this house had had in a very long time. The bread, Naomi couldn't quite get right on her own, sent her into town by the end of the week in search of good flour. And though she wouldn't have admitted it, a reason to see the place she'd be living the rest of her life. Fredericksburg unfolded itself along a wide, dusty main road, stone buildings with steep German roofs, a church spire at one end, chickens picking through the gutters, and at the center of it all, Lindqvist's back house. Its window fogged with the warm breath of ovens and the smell of cinnamon strong enough to reach the street. Greta Lindqvist was a wide, cheerful woman who ran the bakery the way a general runs a campaign, efficiently, loudly, and with absolute command of every piece of information passing through Fredericksburg. She had Naomi's name before Naomi had finished introducing herself, and had already sized up her dress, her posture, and the state of her boots before the door swung fully shut behind her. "You're the one marrying the bear," Greta said, already reaching for flour without being asked, sizing Naomi up the way a woman sizes up a customer she intends to feed opinions along with bread. "Brave girl. My own sister wouldn't set foot past the crossroads out there, not for love nor money. Everyone keeps calling him that. Naomi said. I'd love to know why. So far, I've met a man who argues with goats and hides paper crowns under his hatband. Greta's eyebrows climbed, delighted, and she glanced around the shop, lowered her voice to the particular register of a woman about to enjoy herself thoroughly. 3 years back, traveling horse trader Higgins, I think his name was, tried to sell Widow Kessler a lame mare and take her savings for it. Wouldn't hear no, not even when she cried right there in front of God and everybody. Got ugly about it right there at the dance in the Musbach barn. She leaned in over the flour sacks. Gideon Marsh picked that man up by his collar, carried him out the door like a sack of feed, and set him down outside without a word. Not one word, just walked back in and asked the fiddler to start again like nothing had happened at all. That's it, Naomi said. That's the whole story. That's the whole story, Greta admitted a little sheepish, wiping her hands on her apron. But you tell a story like that enough times over 3 years, in enough different kitchens, and it grows teeth of its own. By now, half the children in this town think he sleeps in the barn with the animals. She handed over the flour, and something in her expression softened the gossip, momentarily set aside for something gentler. Truth is, half this town owes that man something they've never said out loud. Widow Voss had firewood on her porch every week last winter, and never once caught who left it. My own roof got patched after the spring storm while I was at my sister's in Comfort, came home to find it good as new, and not a soul willing to take credit. Nobody signs their name to it. But I've got my guesses, same as everybody does, and we've all just agreed among ourselves not to spoil it by asking. Naomi paid for the flour, with a mind already turning the pieces over, weighing rumor against evidence the way she once weighed a schoolboy's excuse against the state of his slate. A man built like a threat, feared for a single moment, 3 years old, quietly mending fences and roofs and porches, without ever once asking to be thanked. It didn't sound like a bear to her. It sounded like a man who had decided somewhere along the way that being feared was safer than being needed, and safer still than being loved and losing it again. She was halfway back to the wagon, arms full, when a woman she didn't recognize touched her sleeve outside the mercantile. Older, careworn, a shawl pulled tight despite the warm afternoon eyes darting once down the street before she spoke. "You're staying at Bishop Ranch," the woman said. It wasn't a question either. "I am. Tell him—" The woman hesitated, glanced down the street again, as if checking who might overhear. "Tell him Ruth Voss says the wood's still keeping us warm. Tell him he needn't have kept doing it past the first winter, but I'm grateful all the same, and I mean to tell him so myself before the year's out, whether he likes it or not." She pressed Naomi's hand once briefly, her grip surprisingly strong for such a slight woman, and was gone before Naomi could ask anything further, disappearing into the mercantile with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd said more than she meant to. Naomi stood in the street, a long moment, the flour heavy in her arms, and thought about paper crowns and fixed locks and firewood left on porches by a man too proud or too wounded to admit he'd done it. By the time she reached the wagon, she had stopped being curious about the rumor and started being curious about the man underneath it, which she suspected was a far more dangerous thing to be curious about than any goat or any gossip Fredericksburg had to offer. Sunday brought the whole of Fredericksburg to Frieden's chapel, steeple catching the morning light, the smell of beeswax candles thick in the small nave, and every bonnet in 3 counties turned, however briefly, toward the back pew, where Gideon Marsh sat with a new wife beside him, for the first time in living memory. Naomi sat close to him, aware of every eye that found its way to them, and slid quickly away, unwilling to be caught staring, though not quite quick enough to hide the fact that they'd been staring at all. "They're not subtle," she murmured, keeping her eyes forward on the pastor. "They never are," Gideon said, and if the attention bothered him, he didn't let it show beyond the faint tightening around his eyes that Naomi was already learning to read the way she'd once learned to read the weather. Back home, small signs that meant considerably more than they appeared to. Etta and Jonah sat between them, scrubbed and combed and uncharacteristically still, though Jonah spent most of the sermon quietly counting the number of times the pastor said the word grace, a project he reported on in a stage whisper the moment the final hymn concluded. It was after the service on the chapel steps that a stout, well-dressed man with an impressive mustache and an even more impressive opinion of himself planted himself directly in Naomi's path, had already sweeping off his head with a flourish more suited to a stage than a churchyard. "Miss Carter, Mrs. Marsh, I should say. Forgive me, I'm behind on the news." He bowed slightly, a gesture that seemed to cost him some effort around the middle. "Chester Pruitt. I own the ranch 2 sections east." He said this the way another man might announce he owned a kingdom and glanced briefly toward Gideon, as though expecting the name alone to establish some sort of advantage. "Mr. Pruitt," Naomi said carefully, offering nothing more than the name required. "I confess I'm a touch put out." Pruitt continued, entirely undeterred by Gideon's presence, a foot away, arms crossed, saying nothing at all, in a manner that somehow communicated a great deal. "I wrote to the same matrimonial agency not 2 months back. Requested a capable, God-fearing woman of good character, well-spoken, handy with a household. Imagine my surprise learning they'd already sent the very finest one they had straight to Bishopland of all places." He said it like a joke, laughing a little too loudly at his own wit, but his eyes lingered on Naomi a beat too long for it to have been entirely one. "I don't believe I received your letter, Mr. Pruitt," Naomi said evenly. "I only ever answered one. A clerical oversight, surely soon corrected." Pruitt smiled, showing a great many teeth, and turned his attention briefly dismissively toward Gideon. "Marsh, good to see you out among the living. Didn't think marriage would suit a man of your particular temperament." "Pruitt," Gideon said, and the single word carried the exact temperature of a closed door. Naomi felt Gideon's hand settle light as a suggestion, along the back of the pew behind her, not touching her, not quite, just present the way a fence exists to mark a boundary, rather than to trap anything inside it. Pruitt seemed to notice too, because his smile flickered before he replaced his hat and made his farewells with considerably less flourish than he'd arrived with, though not without one last comment about how he hoped Naomi would find Fredericksburg's finer society sufficiently welcoming, as though implying she might not find it welcoming at all where she currently stood. "He wrote to the agency too," Naomi said once he'd gone, half a laugh caught in her throat at the sheer nerve of it, watching Pruitt's retreating back with something between disbelief and amusement. "He writes to every agency between here and San Antonio," Gideon said. "Word is he's on his 4th attempt at a wife. First 3 took one look at Fredericksburg and got straight back on the coach before their trunks were even unloaded." "Can't imagine why," Naomi said, and this time Gideon's mouth did something closer to an actual smile, brief as a struck match, gone before she could hold on to it, though she found herself watching for its return the whole walk to the wagon. They made their way back together, the congregation still murmuring behind them, Etta and Jonah racing ahead through the churchyard grass, in a game that seemed to involve considerable shrieking and very little in the way of rules. Naomi glanced sideways at the man beside her, the one the whole town called a bear, who had just spent 30 seconds silently making it very clear, without raising his voice or his hand, that Chester Pruitt's attentions were not welcome, and thought that whatever else this marriage turned out to be, it would not at least be dull. "Ruth Voss says thank you for the wood," she said, as they reached the wagon. "She told me to pass it along, and made me promise I would." Gideon's hands stilled on the reins for just a moment, a small, telling pause. "I don't know what she means," he said, in a voice that meant precisely the opposite, and helped her up into the seat before she could press him further though the tips of his ears had gone faintly, unmistakably red. Naomi woke at some deep, formless hour of the night, to an empty house not empty of children whose small sounds still drifted from down the hall, but empty of the particular weight of another adult breathing under the same roof. She lay still a moment listening, and heard the soft complaint of the barn door, then the creak of a wagon easing out of the yard, with the deliberate quiet of someone who didn't want to be heard, wheels wrapped, she suspected, to muffle their sound against the gravel. She was dressed and following the wagon ruts, on foot within 10 minutes, her shawl pulled tight against the night chill, curiosity outweighing good sense the way it so often had her whole life ever since she was a girl, following her father out to the barn at odd hours, just to see what he was building. The Voss place sat a mile down the road, and by the time she reached it, she understood exactly what she'd find, because she could already hear the steady, patient sound of a hammer carrying across the still night air. Gideon was working by lantern light at the edge of Ruth Voss's property, replacing rotted fence posts one at a time. His coat off his shirt sleeves, pushed up despite the cold, a small pile of new-cut posts stacked neatly beside him. He didn't hear her approach until she was nearly at his elbow, and when he turned and saw her there, something crossed his face that looked almost like being caught at something shameful rather than something good. "You didn't have to come out here," he said, setting down the hammer with the careful economy of a man used to hiding evidence of his own kindness. "Neither did you," Naomi said, "and yet here we both are, a mile from a warm bed." I was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. The lantern light carving deep shadows under his eyes. "Ruth's husband died 2 winters back," he said finally. "Her boys are grown and gone to Austin, don't write half so often as they ought. She won't ask anyone for help, too proud, same as most folks out here, so I figured what she doesn't know about she can't refuse. Easier for everyone that way." "That's not an answer," Naomi said gently, picking up a discarded plank and turning it over in her hands. "That's a method." I asked why. I was quiet a long moment more, and Naomi let the silence stretch, sensing this was not a question to be rushed. "My father used to say a man's worth what he does when nobody's counting," he said finally. "After my sister died, I had a lot of nights. I couldn't sleep for thinking about everything I hadn't managed to do for her while she was alive, visits. I put off letters I meant to write and never did. Fixing things in the dark for people who'll never know it was me. It doesn't undo anything. But it's something to do with my hands, besides count what I lost." Naomi picked up a spare post and held it steady against the hole he'd dug, the way she'd once held ladders for her father back in Ohio without being asked, because some kindnesses didn't require an invitation, only a willingness to notice they were needed. "You could let people thank you," she said. "It wouldn't make the good you've done any smaller. If anything, I'd think it would make it larger having somewhere to land." "Wouldn't it?" Gideon tamped earth around the base of the post with more force than strictly necessary, the muscles in his forearms working in the lantern light. "Every time this town's needed someone to be afraid of, I've been useful to have around. Man who lifted Higgins off his feet, that story's kept a dozen swindlers off this road, since just from the telling of it, near as I can figure. If I go around softening that up with thank yous and Sunday visits, I lose the only thing that's ever actually protected the people out here who can't protect themselves." Naomi considered that a long moment, the truth and the sadness of it, both settling somewhere near her ribs. "So you let them fear the wrong thing about you," she said slowly, "so they never have to see the right thing." Gideon looked at her over the lantern, something unguarded, moving behind his eyes for just a breath before he covered it, reaching for the next post with hands that weren't quite as steady as they had been a moment before. "Something like that. That's a lonely kind of arithmetic, Gideon Marsh. It's the only kind I've had for a while," he admitted, and reached for the next post, and Naomi understood, holding the wood steady in the cold dark beside him, that she had just been let a small distance further into a man who had spent years making sure nobody got in at all, brick by careful brick fence post by fence post in the dark, where no one was counting but her. The trouble started as trouble involving Jonah so often did, with a door left open. Samson Bishop Ranch's enormous gray-muzzled mastiff, feared on sight by every stranger and adored on sight by every soul who actually knew him, had been left tied at the hitching post outside Hartwell's Mercantile, while Naomi and the children finished up supplies for the coming Herbstfest. Jonah, distracted by a jar of peppermint sticks arranged temptingly near the register, let the rope slip from his hand entirely, and by the time he thought to check on it, Samson was already gone. What followed was, by later town consensus, the single most chaotic 10 minutes Hartwell's Mercantile had seen since the flood of '74. Samson, delighted by his sudden freedom, launched himself joyfully into the store in search of the only person he considered worth the trouble, Naomi, who had been kind to him since her first day and fed him scraps under the table when she thought no one was looking. A fact Samson had apparently filed away as evidence of her supreme importance in the household hierarchy. His enthusiastic arrival upended a display of canned peaches, sent a bolt of blue calico unspooling across the floor in a long, silky ribbon, and startled the store's resident tabby cat straight up onto a shelf of preserves, which came down in a spectacular crash of glass and syrup that seemed for one suspended moment to take the entire store's breath away. Samson, no Samson. Naomi was laughing too hard to be effective, chasing an 80-pound dog who thought the entire affair was a wonderful game arranged in his honor, skidding once herself on a patch of spilled syrup and catching the counter just in time, while Etta shrieked with a joy Naomi hadn't heard from her yet, delighted and scandalized in equal measure. And Jonah stood frozen with the guilty face of a boy fully aware of his crimes and already composing his defense. Gideon arrived at the doorway just as Samson finally skidded to a stop at Naomi's feet, tail sweeping peach syrup in a wide arc across the floorboards, looking enormously pleased with himself, as though he'd single-handedly solved some great and pressing mystery. Mr. Hartwell surveyed the wreckage of his store with the weary expression of a man who had in fact seen worse and had learned long ago that outrage accomplished less than a firm bill. "I'll pay for the peaches," Gideon said, already reaching for his billfold, his eyes doing a quick, practiced inventory of the damage. "And the calico," Hartwell said, "and the preserves. And I'd take it kindly if that animal stayed home from now on, or at least got himself a stronger rope." "He will," Gideon said, though Naomi caught the smallest twitch at the corner of his mouth as he said it, and understood. He found the entire scene at least as funny as she did once he was certain no one had actually been hurt, and no glass had found its way into anyone's boots. They settled the account, mopped what could be mopped with the store's one available broom and a good deal of borrowed rags, and walked out into the afternoon with a wagon full of dented cans and torn calico they'd bought at a steep discount, rather than leave Hartwell holding the loss entirely on his own. Jonah trudged beside the wagon, thoroughly chastened shoulders up around his ears, until Naomi crouched down to his level near the wagon wheel. "You're not in trouble," she said. "Everybody loses hold of a rope sometime. But you'll help me carry every can of those dented peaches into the kitchen, and you'll help me think of a way to make it up to Mr. Hartwell, because that's what people do when they've made a mess, not hide from it, and not spend the whole ride home dreading a scolding that isn't coming. They clean it up, and then they go on." Jonah nodded solemn, and slipped his small hand into hers, without seeming to notice he'd done it the way children do when trust arrives before they've decided to permit it. Etta, walking on Naomi's other side, reached over and took her free hand too, swinging it slightly as they walked, humming some tuneless little song under her breath. And for the length of that dusty road back to Bishop Ranch, Naomi Carter walked between two children who 3 weeks ago wouldn't meet her eyes at supper. Behind them, Gideon drove the wagon slow, watching the three of them ahead of him on the road, and said nothing at all, though Naomi glanced back once and caught an expression on his face she hadn't seen before. Something unguarded and a little stunned, like a man watching a thing he hadn't quite let himself hope for arrive anyway, right there on a dusty road smelling of spilled peaches and syrup. The invitation arrived by way of a boy on horseback 3 days before the Herbstfest, a card heavily embossed, requesting the pleasure of Mrs. Carter's company at a picnic, along with a basket already packed and delivered to the porch, monogrammed in gold thread, with the entirely unsubtle initials CP, as though the sender had wanted there to be no possible confusion about whose invitation it was. Naomi read the card twice, torn between irritation and the particular helpless amusement that came from dealing with a man who simply refused to notice when he wasn't wanted. She was still holding it when Gideon came in from the field's dust on his boots and a coil of rope over one shoulder, and something in his face upon seeing the card and the basket, both sitting together on the porch step, closed over, like weather changing quick and total. "Pruitt," he said. It wasn't a question. "He seems to be under the impression that a piece of paper from an agency and a marriage vow are roughly equivalent obstacles," Naomi said, already reaching for pen and ink to write her refusal, intending the whole matter to be finished within the hour. But Gideon had already turned toward the door, jaw set in a way she hadn't seen since the wedding, and something in his stillness told her the words hadn't quite caught up with him the way they'd caught up with her. "I heard in town you took tea with him Tuesday," he said, and though his voice stayed level, there was a rawness underneath it. She recognized from the dark fence line, at the Voss place old wounds, mistaking new footsteps for the ones that had left before, quick and sure and entirely unfair. "I ran into him outside the church," Naomi said slowly, setting down her pen, meeting his eyes directly so there could be no mistaking her. "He talked at me for 10 minutes about his cattle prices while I was waiting on Etta to finish choosing ribbon. I did not take tea with him, Gideon. I have never taken tea with him. I don't intend to start." "That's not what Greta said." "Then Greta's story grew teeth same as yours did," Naomi said more sharply than she intended, and regretted it the instant she saw something flinch behind his eyes, though she didn't take the words back because they were true and he needed to hear them. He didn't argue further. He simply nodded once the way he did when he was choosing to absorb a thing rather than release it, jaw working, and went back out to the barn, without another word, the door swinging shut behind him, with more force than the wind required, leaving Naomi standing in the kitchen, with a monogrammed picnic basket she hadn't asked for, and a silence in the house that felt different from every other silence she'd learned to read there. She found Etta at this kitchen table that evening, quietly watching her, the way children watch adults when they sense a weather front moving in a piece of embroidery abandoned in her lap. "Uncle Gideon gets quiet like that sometimes," Etta said without being asked, picking at a loose thread. "When Mama was here, and then when she wasn't. He doesn't yell. He just goes somewhere else even when he's standing right there in the room with you." "Does he come back?" Naomi asked, sitting down across from her. Etta considered this with the terrible seriousness of an 8-year-old weighing a true answer against a kind one. Her small brow furrowed. "Eventually," she said. "But somebody usually has to go get him first. Mama used to. I don't know how she did it. I was too little to remember exactly." Naomi sat with that, a long while after the children had gone to bed, the monogrammed basket still sitting untouched on the porch step, where she'd left it as a small act of protest, and thought about a man who fixed fences in the dark and closed doors at the first hint that trust might be misplaced twice in one lifetime. She thought, too, about the woman he'd almost married before her, whoever she'd been, whatever she'd done, and understood, finally, that Pruitt's ridiculous basket wasn't really the thing that had frightened him at all. She banked the fire, left his coffee cup out for morning, the way she always did, and decided that whatever tomorrow required, it would not require her waiting quietly for him to come find his own way back. She found him on the porch after midnight, exactly where she expected to, staring out at land he could probably map with his eyes closed, a cold cup of coffee forgotten at his elbow. She didn't speak right away. She simply sat down beside him on the step, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and waited, the way she'd learned this house required waiting patient, unhurried, willing to let silence do some of the work that words couldn't manage on their own. "I owe you an apology," Gideon said, eventually not looking at her. His eyes fixed somewhere out past the dark shape of the barn. "I know what Pruitt is. I know what he isn't. I let something old get louder than something true, and that's not fair to you, whatever else it is." "Tell me about her," Naomi said gently. "The one before." I was quiet long enough that she thought he might close the door on it entirely, the way he'd closed it that first day in the barn over 3 simple, evasive words. But he didn't. 6 years ago, her name was Louisa. We were set to marry that spring right after my sister's husband died and left her alone with a newborn Etta and no way to manage on her own. He turned the memory over slowly, like a stone he'd carried so long, its edges had gone smooth from handling. Louisa found out what marrying me would mean, a house with a grieving widow and a baby in it, not just a husband and a ranch. Found out gradual over a few weeks, the way a person finds out they've made a mistake. They're too polite to admit outright. She left a note at the dance instead of telling me to my face. Rode out before the fiddler even finished the song. He paused, a muscle working in his jaw. "That's the same dance folks tell the Higgins story about. Same night near enough, though nobody ever thinks to connect the two. I've never told anyone that part. Guess it was easier to let the town remember me as dangerous than remember me as a man left standing alone in a barn with a ring in his pocket." Naomi felt something in her chest go very still and very full at once. "So the whole reputation," she said slowly, "the whole Bear of Bishop Ranch, it isn't really about Higgins at all." "Higgins gave the town its story," Gideon said. "But I'm the one who let it grow the way it did, fed it a little here and there without meaning to, never once corrected it when I could have. Easier to be feared than to be pitied. Easier still than being left again and having the whole town watch it happen a second time." He looked at her, then finally something raw and unguarded moving across his face in the low porch light. "When Pruitt sent that basket, some old foolish part of me heard it as the start of the same story, ending the same way it did before." Naomi reached into her apron pocket and drew out a small square of linen she'd found tucked in the recipe book weeks ago and never mentioned, half a handkerchief embroidered along one edge with delicate blue forget-me-nots. The thread simply stopping partway through needle, still through the last unfinished petal exactly as its maker had left it. "Etta's mother's?" she asked, holding it out where the lantern light could catch the careful stitching. Gideon nodded, throat working. "She started it the week before she took sick. Never got to finish it. I couldn't throw it away, and I couldn't look at it either, so it just sat in that drawer, 2 years gathering dust I couldn't bring myself to wipe off." Naomi turned the fabric over in her hands, then met his eyes. "I'd like to finish it," she said. "Not to erase what happened. Just so it isn't unfinished anymore. Some things deserve to be completed even years late." It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't even quite the words either of them might have used if pressed to name what was happening between them. But Gideon looked at her the way a man looks at solid ground after a long time not trusting anything to hold his weight, and reached over slowly and covered her hand with his, not asking anything of her, just resting there warm and certain in the cold night air, his thumb moving once gently across her knuckles. "Thank you," he said so quietly the words nearly disappeared into the dark. for coming to find me, for not letting me go somewhere else this time. Somebody usually has to, Naomi said, and didn't explain where she'd heard that, and didn't need to because he understood exactly what she meant. By the morning of the Herbstfest, all of Fredericksburg smelled of roasting corn and cinnamon, and the particular excitement of a town given a reason to gather banners strung between the stone buildings, children weaving between adult legs with sticky hands. The fiddler already tuning somewhere near the churchyard, well before the sun had fully cleared the rooftops. Naomi and Gideon had claimed a small booth near the churchyard stacked with loaves made from a dead woman's recipe, and at Etta's insistence a hand-painted sign reading Bishop Ranch Bakery, in her careful looping script copied letter by letter from a primer she'd been practicing all week in secret. Gideon, entirely out of his depth, behind a bake table, wore an apron Naomi had tied on him over his protests, and handled the cash box with the wary concentration of a man disarming something dangerous, counting coins twice for every transaction, and apologizing each time he made a customer wait. He was terrible at it, and utterly endearing in his terribleness, and more than one passerby did a visible double-take at the sight of the bear of Bishop Ranch counting out change for a slice of streusel, with such careful, furrowed gravity, as though the fate of the entire festival rested on getting it exactly right. Chester Pruitt, predictably, had entered the fest's baking contest with a towering, over-frosted cake he'd clearly paid someone else to make. The seams of the frosting work were too fine for a man who'd never so much as boiled water and spent the morning circling their booth with transparent wounded pride, muttering about unfair advantages to anyone who'd listen, and pausing twice to inform Naomi unprompted that his cake used a recipe passed down from his own grandmother in Charleston, a claim nobody in earshot found remotely believable. When the contest results were finally called from the church steps, Naomi's crooked-crusted, honestly made bread, taking second place to Greta Lindqvist's unbeatable strudel, and Pruitt's cake, landing a distant and much-mocked fourth behind even a 12-year-old's gingerbread. He retreated toward the lemonade stand, with the air of a man recalculating his entire courtship strategy, from the ground up, his mustache drooping with the general injustice of it all. It was mid-afternoon, in the lull between the contest and the dancing, that Etta climbed up onto the bench beside Naomi, sun-flushed and sticky with cider cheeks, pink from running races with the other children, and leaned her head against Naomi's arm the way she'd never once done before, comfortable and unthinking, the way a child leans against something she trusts will hold her weight. "Mama," she said so easily, it took Naomi a full second to understand what word had just been spoken. "Can I have another peppermint stick? Jonah already had 2, and it's not fair." The booth went very quiet. Gideon's hands stilled over the cash box, a coin held forgotten between his fingers. Naomi felt something crack open in her chest, wide and warm and entirely without warning, and had to blink hard before she trusted her voice. "Of course you can," she said, and it came out steadier than she felt, though her eyes had gone unmistakably bright. Etta, apparently unaware of the small earthquake she'd just caused, hopped down and ran off toward the candy stall, Jonah trailing after her, already negotiating loudly for a peppermint of his own, on the grounds of general fairness. Naomi looked up and found Gideon watching her, the cash box entirely forgotten, an expression on his face she'd never seen there before, something unguarded and wondering, and a little undone, like a man who'd just watched something impossible happen in broad daylight. "She's never called anyone that," he said quietly once he'd found his voice again. "Not since her mother. Not once, not even close, not even by accident. I didn't ask her to," Naomi said. "I promise you that. I never once." "I know," Gideon said. "That's exactly why it means what it means." Across the churchyard, the fiddler was tuning up for the evening dance, and Naomi could see Chester Pruitt already angling toward their booth again, cake failure apparently forgotten some fresh scheme visibly assembling itself behind his mustache. But for one long, suspended moment, none of that mattered at all. Not the town's old fears, not the rumors 3 years in the growing, not even the man circling closer with his wounded pride and his monogrammed everything. There was only a girl running toward peppermint sticks, with a word still hanging warm in the autumn air behind her, and a man standing very still beside a cash box looking at Naomi like the whole shape of his life had just quietly, permanently changed. The dancing had just begun when Ruth Voss climbed onto the church steps uninvited and entirely undeterred by her own shyness, and asked the fiddler to hush a moment. Fredericksburg, mid-swirl in its Herbstfest waltzes, slowed and turned to look lanterns strung overhead, swaying gently in the evening breeze. And Naomi felt Gideon go rigid beside her, already sensing where this was headed, one hand finding hers almost without his notice. "Most of you know me," Ruth said, her voice carrying further than her small frame suggested. It could steadied by something that looked very much like resolve, finally winning out over a lifetime's habit of keeping quiet. "Some of you know my husband's been gone 2 winters now. What most of you don't know is that every week of that first hard winter firewood showed up on my porch before dawn, stacked neat, no note, no name enough to see me through, when I didn't know how I'd manage otherwise." She paused, found Gideon's eyes across the churchyard, and held them, her chin lifted. "I know who it was. I've known for a year. I only kept quiet because he asked me to, and because I understood somehow that he needed the quiet more than I needed the credit." A murmur moved through the crowd like wind through wheat. Greta Lindqvist, standing near the punch bowl, was nodding slowly, arms crossed, wearing the satisfied look of a woman whose suspicions had finally been confirmed in public after months of guessing. "My roof," Greta called out, unable to help herself. "Spring storm. I never did find out who fixed it while I was in comfort, though I had my ideas, same as everyone else here tonight, I'd wager." Someone else spoke up, old Mr. Braun, whose fence had mended itself overnight, 2 autumns back, the posts, new and sturdy, where they'd been rotted through before. Then another voice and another small confessions of unclaimed kindness rising up out of the crowd, like the town had been quietly keeping a ledger of its own all along. Entry by entry, waiting for permission to read it aloud together. Gideon stood very still through all of it, color rising in his face, looking for all the world like a man being unmasked against his will, which Naomi supposed he was layer by layer, right there in front of the whole town he'd spent 3 years keeping carefully at arm's length. She slipped her hand into his and felt him grip it back hard, grounding himself against the sudden weight of a town looking at him, and seeing for the first time in 3 years exactly who he actually was underneath the story he'd let them believe. "So there it is?" Ruth finished a little breathless from her own boldness, cheeks flushed pink in the lantern light. "The bear of Bishop Ranch. Folks have been afraid of the wrong thing about that man for 3 years running, and I, for one, am tired of letting a good man carry a bad story just because he's too stubborn to correct it himself." Laughter rippled through the crowd, warm rather than mocking, and somewhere near the punch bowl, Chester Pruitt had gone the particular shade of red belonging to a man realizing all at once that his rival's terrible reputation had just evaporated in front of the entire town, taking Pruitt's own chances with it clean along with it. He made a quiet, dignified retreat toward his cake plate that nobody troubled to notice, mustache drooping in defeat. Gideon cleared his throat, and Fredericksburg, still buzzing, quieted to hear him, every eye once again on the man they'd feared, and it now seemed badly misunderstood. "I never meant it to become a story people believed," he said plainly, the way he said most things, no flourish, no performance, just the truth laid out simple. Seemed simpler to let folks keep their distance than to explain myself. I see now that wasn't fair to anybody, least of all the people I was trying to help, and least of all these two children who deserved a house that welcomed people in instead of keeping them out. His eyes found Naomi's, and something in his voice changed, softened, aimed entirely at her, though the whole town stood listening. I've been informed recently by someone considerably braver than I am that good done in secret doesn't get any smaller for being seen. He reached into his coat pocket and drew out a small square of linen. The forget-me-nots finally finished the last stitches, new and slightly uneven, where Naomi's hand had learned the pattern over several quiet evenings. He pressed it into her palm, his fingers lingering a moment against hers. "I'm not asking you anything you haven't already answered," he said, quiet enough that it was almost just for her, though every soul in the churchyard leaned in to hear it anyway. But I wanted to ask it anyway in front of everybody who ever called me something I wasn't. Naomi Carter, will you keep choosing this, choosing us? Not because a letter agency put us together, but because you want to every day plainly the way I'm choosing you right now. Naomi looked down at the finished handkerchief, then up at the man the whole town had feared for 3 years, over a story that was never really about danger at all, only about a heart too guarded to let itself be seen. Etta and Jonah had pressed in close on either side of her small hands, finding hers, and Samson had wandered over to lean his enormous, gentle weight against Gideon's leg with a contented sigh, and the whole ridiculous, wonderful shape of her new family stood waiting in the autumn light for her answer. "Every day," Naomi said, "for as long as you'll have me, Gideon Marsh Bear of Bishop Ranch and all." The fiddler, sensing his cue better than anyone in the churchyard, struck up the waltz again, and the Bear of Bishop Ranch, no longer feared, only known, only loved, led his wife out into the dancing, while the whole of Fredericksburg cheered like they'd been waiting 3 years for exactly this, lanterns swaying overhead, the last of the summer light gone gold and soft across the churchyard grass.
That's the story of Gideon Marsh and Naomi Carter, a man so afraid of being left that he let an entire town believe he was dangerous, and a woman brave enough to work past the warnings and find out for herself. It's a story about how the kindest heart often hide behind the toughest reputation, and how sometimes all it takes to unmask a bear is somebody willing to stay long enough to see him clearly, and children brave enough to call a stranger by a word that means everything. I would love to know where you're watching from tonight. Drop your city below. I read every single one. It always amazes me how far a little story like this one can travel. If this story warmed your heart, hit like and subscribe because we've got another one coming soon. And trust me, you won't want to miss it. Until then, take care of each other and maybe check on the quiet ones in your own town. You never know what they are carrying along or what small kindness might finally say it down.